Hi everyone, this is Western Civ 1. I'm Dr. Young. Today we're going to talk about the culture of the High Middle Ages. And if you recall, culture means the products of the human mind, things that people think, whereas society is how people live. These are the two kind of broadest divisions of civilization as we've defined them, at least in this course. But we need to break culture in this case down into a couple of different categories. Okay, we have what scholars have called popular culture. That means the culture of the unlearned people, the common people. And in the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people could not read or write and thus had little to no access to literary culture. There were some places where popular and high culture came together, and I'll talk about those over at least one or two instances of that over the course of this video lecture. But popular culture is the thought processes, the products that come out of people who are not learned. It is primarily an oral culture, though it may partake in some cases of things that are literate. For instance, in the Middle Ages, and in fact in many periods in European history all the way to the present, one of the key components of culture has been the biblical tradition, which of course goes back to an ancient text called the Bible. In the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people could not read the Bible, but they nevertheless heard stories from the Bible. There was a perception that the Bible was this authoritative text, and people heard stories about the great figures from the Bible, the flood of Noah, for instance, stories from the Old Testament about Abraham and Moses and these sorts of things, and of course stories about Jesus and the early Christian disciples from the New Testament. They didn't read those stories, but they heard them preached in churches. They perhaps saw them in church art. They may have even talked about them themselves. And the product that came out from that, the conversations they had in this oral setting, probably differed a great deal from what the text actually said, but it was nevertheless real for those who thought about it, or who participated in that culture. It was important to them. The perception of the way the world works that was based on the stories from the Bible was real, even though these people could not read the Bible, right? And thus we have, and sorry this is a bit conceptual, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying here. We have in the Middle Ages what one scholar, Brian Stock, called textual communities. Communities that are people that communities, I should say, that identify with texts, even if the people who believe in those texts and sort of formulate their lives around those texts cannot actually read them, right? Now, the Bible was not the only text that was important to people on the popular level. There were others. In fact, there was a whole tradition of European folklore, some of it Christian in nature and some of it otherwise. There were still remnants left over from pagan antiquity. And in some cases, these kinds of things came together. There's a very interesting case from the 13th century that has been elaborated on by the French scholar Jean-Claude Schmitt, where he talks about as churchmen involved in what was called the Inquisition, and that word probably evokes a great deal of emotion, perhaps fear or something like that in people, given the stereotypes we have about the Inquisition. I'll talk about the Inquisition as we go on here. Most of those stereotypes are untrue, or at least they are inflated from what reality was. But anyway, as inquisitors were looking into charges of heresy in the French countryside, they were interviewing people, and they came upon this whole kind of region where people venerated a saint known as Guinefor. And as they dug into this, they found out that they'd never heard of Guinefor. This was a new saint to them, and these local saints, local cults of saints, were not necessarily irregular in the Middle Ages. There were lots of these kinds of things, but this Guinefor was a mystery to the inquisitors. As they interviewed people and kind of dug into this story, they figured out that Guinefor was a dog. The that these people were venerating, even worshiping a saint that was not even human. And there was a whole story behind this. The story went something like this: Guinefor, or rather, Guinefor was a dog. He was the possession of a noble family in France. This family had a small child, a baby, and the husband and wife went out for an outing of some kind, went to church, whatever it was. I can't remember the exact details. They left the baby sleeping in a cradle. This, of course, would be illegal in the modern world. And under the protection of the dog, the loyal family dog. Well, while the couple was away, a serpent entered the room where the baby was sleeping and intended to devour the baby. And Guinefor, the dog, was protecting the child, and got into a fight with the snake and managed to kill the snake, but in the process sort of turned over a lot of the furniture, including the cradle where the child was, and the room was a mess, right? Well, when the couple returned home, they went into the room where the baby was supposed to be. They found the cradle overturned, a lot of the furniture rearranged, things all over the place, and they looked at the dog and it had blood all over its muzzle. And the assumption immediately was, this dog has killed our child. And so the father took out his sword and killed the dog. And then as they searched a little further, they realized that the baby was actually sleeping just fine, even though the cradle had been overturned. And they found the dead snake and realized that the dog had killed the snake. And the couple was heartbroken about killing their loyal dog. And this story led ultimately to more stories about a dog that appeared mysteriously to protect children who were lost in the forest, and even to guide them home if they were lost. So this is the medieval version of Lassie or something like that, right? And over time, this dog had come to be venerated as a Christian saint. And so you can see there that, we've got things that are based on texts. That is, there were saints were venerated since antiquity, but the folklore is sort of borderline Christian there. No Christian authority would have sanctioned the veneration of a dog as a saint, for instance, right? And so there we venture into the realm of folklore. And here we have these representatives of the high culture, these inquisitors who are looking into what people believe in the countryside and among the illiterate people, and they find out that they're venerating or worshiping this dog, right? And so that's an interesting case of the dynamic between popular and high culture that existed in this period. Now, one scholar, a German scholar named Herbert Grunmann, back in the 1930s wrote a book called Religiöse Bewegung im Mittelalter, or translated Religious Movements in the Middle Ages. And by religious movements he meant movements among commoners on a fairly large scale that were motivated by their religious identities. And this happened in the Middle Ages as the institutional church participated in reform, as Christianity became more and more a part of people's lives, as the process of Christianization achieved its full realization in Europe. Lay people, common people, desired religious experiences that led them to kind of band together in movements. Now, some of these movements were ultimately accepted by the institutional church and became, in a sense, part of the high culture, part of at least the institutionalized culture. Other religious movements were rejected by the institutional church and came to be considered heretical, right? Now, what's really interesting about this, and what Grunmann goes on to point out, is the movements that were accepted by the institutional church often are very similar to the movements that were rejected by the institutional church. And so let me give some concrete examples here to demonstrate this dynamic. All right. In the 12th century, or yeah, let's see, it was about the 1170s, 1160s, 1170s. There was a fellow living in southern France, specifically in the city of Lyon, named Peter Valdez. Okay, this statue up here is of Peter Valdez, otherwise known as Peter Waldo. Depends on which language you're speaking. But anyway, we'll call him Peter Valdez. Valdez was a merchant, and this in an era, as we've talked about, of great sort of commercial expansion, a growing economy. And Peter Valdez had taken advantage of that, had procured for himself through his mercantile activities a good deal of wealth. But when he reached middle age, he was about 35 or 40, I think, he decided that all of this effort to procure money had in fact led him away from God and was corrosive to his soul. And so Valdez made the decision to give away everything that he had. Now, there's some question of whether he was literate, but in any case, he had heard the story about Jesus telling his followers that they should not take a thought for what they wear or what they need to eat or anything like that, that God will provide everything for them. He took that very literally and decided to give away all of his worldly possessions. He sort of left his wife, although he did provide some money to see her through the rest of her days, and went out and decided to take up the life of a hermit. Now, Peter Valdez, as he did this, he looked around and saw that many of the figures in the church were not exactly doing what Jesus had enjoined them to do. The church itself was quite wealthy, and he saw this led to some corruption among churchmen. And so Valdez began to preach in condemnation of the church, preaching to others about the necessity of giving everything away, of living a life of poverty and simplicity, right? And so now Valdez seems to have drawn the anger of churchmen. The Bishop of Lyon and other churchmen in the area were worried about what he said. They told him to cut it out. Valdez continued to preach, and ultimately his case came before the Pope, who also condemned it at the Third Lateran Council, and Valdez was branded as a heretic. Now, Valdez's message resonated with a lot of people who agreed with what he was saying and were interested in following his example and taking up this life as a hermit. And so this resulted in a fairly widespread movement known as the Waldensian movement. Now, what's interesting about this is that Valdez was not necessarily saying anything that was theologically suspect. There had been heretics, so to speak, who we might call intellectual or theological heretics, people who had taught and written about things that were found to be heretical, right? That's not Peter Valdez. Rather, it was his behavior and his insistence that the church give away its wealth, that it was, his criticism of the church in effect, that made him objectionable, right? And so he was branded as a heretic for that reason. Now, fast forward about 30, 40 years to Italy, and let's meet another important figure from this period, pictured here in an illustration. This guy's name is Francis of Assisi. Okay, Francis was not a merchant himself. He was rather the son of a merchant, a wealthy merchant, and his father had sort of purchased titles. This is one of the things that we've talked about. There was a great deal of social mobility for people who managed to procure a lot of wealth, mostly urban merchants. And Francis could have taken up his father's business, or he could have become a knight. These are the kinds of things that his father had been grooming him for. But when Francis reached late teens, early 20s, he had a religious conversion experience where he became convinced that God wanted him to live a life of absolute poverty. In a sense, he had the very same kind of religious experience that Peter Valdez had had a few decades previously, right? And so Francis rejected his father's wealth, really sort of renounced his inheritance, and took up life as a hermit, living a simple existence. He actually found, took up a residence in a ruined church outside of the city of Assisi, wore nothing but a simple rough gray habit that was like the habit of the clothing that monks wore, but he didn't enter a monastery or anything like that. Rather, he preferred to live a life of begging and offering simple teachings about the Christian gospel. Well, Francis had a very disarming personality. He drew a lot of people to him. He was quite convincing. And he ended up with quite a number of followers who all wanted to pursue the same kind of lifestyle. Now, in Francis's case, although his father objected to his decisions, the churchmen in the area found him quite appealing. The Bishop of Assisi was a personal patron of sorts. And in the year in the 12 teens, when Francis was in middle age, he even took his case before the Pope, Innocent III in this case, and Innocent was charmed with him as well. At the Fourth Lateran Council, Innocent gave permission, or rather the council with Innocent's backing, gave permission for Francis to start a new religious order, which would not be like traditional monasteries. That is, the Franciscans, as they came to be called, did not live constantly in a monastery removed from the world. They lived like monks, that is, patterning their day after periods of prayer and things like this. But they were also to go out and interact with the common people and to teach and preach to them and pray for them and provide pastoral care and things like this. Now the question is, why was Francis accepted and allowed to start an order that was part of the institutional church, where Peter Valdez, who preached pretty much the same message and took up the same kind of lifestyle, was rejected and branded as a heretic? Well, there are a couple of things that we might point out. First of all, the personalities of the two men. Peter Valdez seems to have been quite combative and acerbic, while Francis of Assisi was disarming and personally appealing. And moreover, Francis, even though he determined upon that lifestyle for himself, never taught that the church should reject wealth, right? He always gave pride of place to the churchmen, whether we're talking about the Bishop of Assisi or Pope Innocent III or whoever it was, who were, anyway, the churchmen who were in authority over him, right? And I think we also have to consider that in the 1170s in southern France, heresy had become a real problem, and the Waldensians were seen as just another heretical group to give the institutional church problems, whereas in the 12 teens, the Franciscans were, the atmosphere was not quite so threatening. So, these movements could be accepted by the church or they could be rejected by the church. The important point here is that people were interested in, the religious culture, even if they could not read and write. They wanted a part of this, so to speak. Now, there are other examples of heretical movements, and there are other examples of Orthodox movements. The figure at the bottom right here is Dominic Guzman, who started the Dominican order, an order similar in some ways to the Franciscans. That is, they did not live permanently in a cloister, but rather interacted with people and provided pastoral care. The dominant impulse of the Dominicans, though, was not toward the life of a poor hermit, but rather as traveling teachers. Dominicans were enjoined to become supremely educated in the Christian gospel and to use that education they received to preach Orthodox Christianity to everyone who they came in contact with, including especially heretics and, for some Dominicans, Muslims. And the idea was that Dominicans would, be able to convert people if they knew the Christian gospel better than anyone else. They could preach it more effectively. Right. On the other hand, there were other heretical movements that did threaten the church both theologically and socially. The most important of these was the Cathar movement, which flourished in southern France and northern Italy, in other words, in the mountainous regions of Europe that were remote, in the Alps and Pyrenees especially. There were entire communities, even cities, that belonged to the Cathar order. The Cathars had their own kind of rival clergy that operated, and so this was an existential threat to the church. The church tried several options to root out heresy, especially the Cathar heresy. They sent Dominicans to preach to them, and that was in fact one of the kind of reasons for allowing the foundation of the Dominican order, was to combat the spread of Catharism. When that didn't work, the Pope called a crusade against the Cathars, and armies were sent, organized and sent to southern France, and they ended up sacking several cities where there were lots of heretics. But even that did not arrest the spread of Catharism. Finally, in the 13th century, the church created this body called the Inquisition, which is really, I mean, there are lots of stereotypes about the Inquisition, that they, tortured people, and things like this. There are also kind of parodies of the Inquisition. Monty Python has a really good one if you're not acquainted with that. But most of these kind of dark, scary views of the Inquisition come from propaganda composed by Protestants during the Protestant Reformation. And this isn't necessarily based in reality. In truth, the Inquisition was kind of like the FBI of the medieval Catholic Church. These were people, inquisitors were sent to investigate, to find out what the heretics believed, and to figure out who in what communities were heretics. And once they did so, they made accusations against them and worked together with the secular authorities to have these people arrested and tried. And of course, there were some people executed for heresy, but more commonly, heretics were, just given some sort of sentence. Heretics who were willing to recant their beliefs and give confession to some priest and sort of enter back into orthodoxy were usually dismissed without further punishment. Did the Inquisition use torture? Yes, on occasion as an interrogation tactic, though a confession made under torture was never admissible in court, and a person who had undergone torture had to then subsequently give the same confession without being under duress. Otherwise, it would not be admitted, and it would be assumed that the confession was only made because they were being tortured. Of course, there is the possibility they could be tortured again, which might convince them, even if they weren't under duress, to make the same sort of confession. Right. Anyway, the Inquisition began operating, especially in these remote regions in the mountains of southern France and northern Italy, starting in the 13th century. All right. There's a lot more we could say about popular culture in the Middle Ages, but I want to turn our attention now to high culture, which will include a discussion of some of the institutions where high culture was produced, and then some examples of that high culture. And this will get us into some of the assigned texts that you were given for this week, as well as a discussion of Abelard and Heloise, which is the text that you need to write the paper on for this week. So, high cultural institutions. Monasteries all through the Middle Ages were the most common place where people received education. Monasteries did tend to be quite conservative in their outlook, and so monks were less likely to write new and original kinds of things, and they were to, write works that were intended for worship purposes and things like this. That's not to say there was no creativity or originality to monasteries, and the vast majority of educated people were monks or products of monasteries in any case. But they were less cutting edge than some other institutions. Starting in about the 11th century, though, with some important changes in the 12th and 13th centuries, cathedral schools came to the fore as the leading educational institutions in Western Europe. In most places, this was not the case necessarily everywhere. Cathedral schools were just that. They were schools created in cathedrals by bishops primarily for the purpose of training clergymen in the liberal arts tradition, teaching them how to read and write and speak and argue and things like this, and then moving on to the study of higher disciplines. In the Middle Ages, that meant either theology or law or medicine or perhaps what we would call science, what they called at the time natural philosophy, right? There were some cathedral schools who developed a reputation for being particularly good at what they did, at providing education. And so these cathedral schools tended to be the most in-demand places to gain an education. People came, students, and by students I mean young men for the most part, seeking a career in the church or potentially in government, mostly noble or royal, came from all over Europe to attend the most renowned cathedral schools. These were in places like Paris and Laon and Chartres and some of the places in northern Italy like Bologna. These had the most popular and the cathedral schools with the highest reputation. Now, scholars could also be itinerant, attending multiple schools over their period of life. As you will read in the Historia Calamitatum of Peter Abelard, he attended several schools, including Laon and Paris, and found them wanting, found the schoolmasters there to be dry and unoriginal. He even says, and of course we have to take his word for it, that he challenged both William of Champeaux, who was a schoolmaster in Paris, and some of Laon, to intellectual contests, and easily defeated these old stodgy schoolmasters. Of course, you know that we only have Abelard's version of that. But in any case, you can see from that and Abelard was not the exception, he was the rule, that students could often travel to multiple schools over the course of their education. Now, these cathedral schools, as we've discussed, eventually blossomed during the 12th century into universities. In Paris, the cathedral school linked up with other places offering education, the Abbey of St. Victor, which, by the way, is where William of Champeaux went after Abelard kind of forced him out of the school of Paris in shame, again, according to Abelard. But the Abbey of St. Victor, the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the Abbey of Saint-Geneviève, and these other places all had intellectuals of some renown, and students could go and attend lectures given at each of these institutions and sort of receive credit for that under this umbrella organization of the university. Right. By the 13th century, the most famous schoolmen in Europe, including Thomas Aquinas, who we'll talk about later, were involved at these burgeoning universities in Paris and Bologna, and eventually in places like Oxford and Cambridge and Prague. That's where the action was intellectually, right? Another place that produced high culture, though, and one that we should not ignore, is the royal and or noble court. And I don't mean court of law here. I mean the gathering of people at the residence or a residence of some important individual, a king, a duke, a count. All of them had their courts and hangers-on, their vassals who owed them allegiance, or the sons and daughters of their vassals, and these provided places where people composed literature, where they sought forms of entertainment that led to the composition of texts. In fact, it was in the royal and noble courts that literature in the vernacular, that is not in Latin, which is what the church worked in, but in the vernacular, in the the common languages in English and French and Italian and German and Spanish and so forth and so on. Literature in those languages began to take hold on the imagination. So I want to look at a few products of high culture, and some of these will bridge the divide between popular and high culture a bit, but for the most part we're going to be dealing with things produced in monasteries or cathedral schools or universities or in the courts here. All right. The first product of high culture that I want to talk about is architecture. One of the great achievements, I think, of the people of the High Middle Ages was their architecture, especially when it came to making religious buildings like cathedrals or monastic churches. There are two major architectural styles in the High Middle Ages, one preceding the other. The earlier of the two is Romanesque. This is one of the best examples of Romanesque architecture. This is the Abbey of Vézelay in central France, and the Abbey Church of Vézelay, I should say. This was part of a larger monastic institution there. And you can see from this building some of the key features of Romanesque architecture. First of all, it's Romanesque. That means it's like Roman. The key feature is this rounded arch, right? This is the hallmark of Roman architecture, and these buildings in the High Middle Ages also used that. This style of architecture flourished, especially in France and Spain and Italy, in the to some extent in German lands as well, and also in Norman England in the 11th and 12th centuries. One of the architectural problems of the rounded arch is that it's not a good weight supporting structure. Thus, Romanesque buildings had to have thick walls. And you can see here that these walls with lots of big supports and things like that, although this building was finished, I should say, in Gothic style. So the pointed arch up here, which I'll discuss in a minute, but the lower parts of this are Romanesque. So the walls are very thick. There's not a lot of space for windows. You can see the windows are quite small here. Romanesque buildings, although some of them did reach some height, they had to be shorter than the later Gothic buildings would be. Now, all of this stone gave the opportunity for some creativity, for some artistic creativity, right? And a lot of this creativity revolved around the purpose of these Romanesque churches. The best examples of Romanesque churches are pilgrimage churches. Most of these dedicated to one or another saint whose relics were housed in these churches. And pilgrimage was one of the most important religious activities of this period. This is one of the key forms of penance. It was something that, the majority of individuals probably in the Middle Ages participated at one point or another in their lives in pilgrimage, right? There were major pilgrimage routes to famous shrines that people came to from all over Europe. The most important of these were the shrines in the city of Rome, also in Jerusalem, which we've discussed when we talked about the Crusades. And the other key pilgrimage center was in northwestern Spain in a place called Santiago de Compostela. Santiago in Spanish means St. James, and it was believed that St. James the Apostle, if you're familiar with the New Testament at all, you may know Peter, James, and John. This is the James the Greater, the Apostle of Jesus. It was thought that his bones were buried in northwestern Spain, where he had gone to preach the gospel and where he was martyred. And so these churches developed not only in Santiago. This is part of the Romanesque Church of Santiago de Compostela. You can see the thick supporting pillars and what's called the barrel vaulting up here with the rounded arches and everything, and the rounded arches in the nave of the church here. Okay, so not only Santiago de Compostela, but all along the route to Santiago, whether pilgrims were coming from Paris or from Germany or from Italy, there were these pilgrimage churches all along the way, built in Romanesque style. This is one of them. You can see the apse here, which is this rounded part on the eastern end of the building usually. And the purpose of the apse was to give space for people to walk around the main altar of the church where the relics of whatever saint were buried or housed in that church were kept, right? Um, and so people came from all over to, they were destined for Santiago, but they would stop at these pilgrimage churches on the way and venerate the relics of Saint Lazarus or Sainte Foy or whatever saint happened to be buried there. Okay. Now, all of this stone on the Romanesque churches, like I said, gave opportunity for artistic creativity. So lots and lots of sculpture on a Romanesque church. Some of it is quite simple. This is a depiction on a Romanesque church of Adam and Eve being tempted by the devil. You can tell he's the devil here because evil spirits or demons are always shown with these like bags under their eyes, like they haven't slept in several weeks or something like that. That's a standard Romanesque feature to display evil. You can also see the serpent here. So the devil is actually portrayed twice, once coming to Eve in the form of a serpent, another time coming in an anthropomorphic form to Adam. Eve is eating the fruit. Adam is about to pick the fruit off of the tree, signifying, of course, that Eve was the first one to take that, right? So that's quite a simple message, and you can see these sorts of things, although, the grotesquerie and things like this are also hallmark features of Romanesque art. Sometimes the sculpture could be quite a bit more elaborate. One of the most common things shown in Romanesque buildings is the Last Judgment scene, usually over the west or main door of the church. Here is one of the key Romanesque churches on the route to Santiago, in a place in Burgundy, eastern France, that is, called Autun. And this is a kind of a quintessential Last Judgment scene. You can see Jesus depicted up here, framed in this oval, and surrounding him are different witnesses to the judgment. You've got Mary and the apostles here. One of them is Peter holding a key, and so they're identifiable iconographically. Over here on the left side is a depiction of heaven, which is shown as having Romanesque architecture, right? And there are angels sort of conducting the blessed souls who have inherited heaven into heaven. Over here on the right, the souls are being weighed in the balance. Looks like this person's in good shape because their good deeds, represented by the angel shown here, who's doing the weighing, outweigh the bad deeds. And here we have a demon who's trying to pull down on the scale to make it tip in favor of the bad deeds. But this person seems to be okay. Over here we have the mouth of hell. You can't see it very well on this image, but the standard feature is the mouth of hell, usually depicted as a dragon or what looks like an alligator, actually, but it's not. And souls being, herded into that place. Interestingly, on the Autun Cathedral tympanum here, on the lintel, this place below the tympanum, we can identify some other characters. This side is what we call the procession of the blessed, people who are going to get into heaven, and they're just waiting to have Jesus tell them, go, welcome to heaven. And you can't see it very well. We'd have to zoom in here. But we have some readily identifiable figures iconographically. These two figures who are holding satchels are pilgrims, and it's not coincidental given that this is a pilgrimage church. One of them has a satchel with a cross on it that would indicate pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The other one has a satchel with a scallop shell. That was the symbol of pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. And so the message is quite clear. Pilgrims are among the blessed, and they get into heaven, right? And that would have been a nice message for all these pilgrims who were headed for Santiago to hear. Okay. This figure is dressed in chainmail and is identifiable as a crusader. Autun, not coincidentally, was a key center for the kind of jumping off point for the Crusades. There were some Crusades who embarked from this region. The Second Crusade among them. And so it's quite predictable that there would be a crusader on this. Although this building does, or this sculpture program does predate the Second Crusade, so there's a lot of recruiting in any case in Burgundy for crusaders to go to the Holy Land to prop up the activities of the crusader states there. Over here we see a couple of bishops. They're identifiable because they're holding shepherd's crooks. This it's not coincidental that this program was commissioned by the Bishop of Autun, and so one of these figures may represent him, or at least others like him. Over here, these are the damned who are awaiting judgment. Some of them seem to be already understanding what's going to happen to them. Here we have a poor soul with demonic hands reaching down and grasping its head, right? And then over here we have depicted a heretic. I won't explain why this is a heretic, but suffice it to say that it is. And this happened to be an area where there was a lot of heresy, heretical accusations going on, so it's understandable why they would put a heretic on this among the damned, right? So we can read a lot from a sculpture program like this, a lot of, kind of social realities or beliefs that people had. The message, though, is quite clear. If you enter the church, you're preparing yourself for judgment, right? For the judgment of Christ that will come inevitably to every person. Now, architecture changed pretty dramatically beginning in the mid-12th century. You might not notice all of the features here, but there was a change to a new style of architecture. Scholars in the modern period called this Gothic. That was meant as an insult. They didn't particularly like Gothic compared to the Renaissance architecture which came after it, which they saw as much more aesthetically pleasing. I don't happen to agree with them. Gothic really meant barbaric. Okay, I'm not sure how anyone can look at this style of architecture and say it's barbaric, but in any case, that's the label that's been given to it. In the 12th and 13th centuries, this was simply called modern architecture. And so that's not Gothic is not a name that would have been applied to what these people were doing in the Middle Ages, right? The key feature of Gothic architecture is the pointed arch rather than the rounded arch, right? And often this cross vaulting, where the arches are placed in diagonal relationship to each other. And this combination of things, the pointed arch and the cross vaulting, allows the arches themselves to take the weight of the building, which means that the Gothic cathedral, or the Gothic building, whatever it is, doesn't have to have walls that are as thick as the Romanesque walls. And in fact, in the spaces between the arches, they could put windows, large windows, to let in lots of light, light being a metaphor for the presence of God, right? The Gothic cathedral was seen as a microcosm of the universe. There was a crypt underneath it. So here's the main altar. You can see this is Cologne Cathedral in Western Germany. There's the main altar. You have the pointed arches up here. There's a crypt underneath the altar, which represents the underworld or hell. The main floor here of the nave is the terrestrial sphere, the earth. The altar is the place where heaven and earth touch, because that's where God becomes man, where the Eucharist is consecrated and becomes the literal body and blood of Jesus Christ, who is God. And then the upper reaches, with all of the light streaming through the windows, represents heaven. Right. By the way, Cologne Cathedral is not entirely medieval like many of these. This is one that has been built and rebuilt and added on to over many centuries. And so, if you look at one of these cathedrals, chances are you're going to see a lot of modern additions to this, though in the Gothic style. Okay. Now, although there was a lot of sculpture on Gothic buildings that is significant, the greatest creativity, I would argue, in Gothic buildings came in the form of the windows. And you can see the windows of Saint Denis over here, which, here's a picture of the exterior of Saint Denis, is hailed as the first Gothic building. And you can see that some of this is still done in Romanesque. These arches are Romanesque. But the latter part of this is done with the pointed arches, and especially these windows, right? So here is the apse of Saint Denis, and you can see that each of these windows is a way to tell a story, usually stories from the Bible. At the eastern end where the altar was, the most common depiction was of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, and different biblical stories and stories of the lives of saints and things like that were told all around. Maybe the best example of this 13th century Gothic, kind of the heyday of Gothic, is Chartres Cathedral. This might be something, by the way, that you see on the final exam. Have to analyze this, so it'd be good to pay attention to everything here. You can see both a diagram of this. All of these churches are laid out in the cross shape. The nave is the main kind of hallway of the church, with the side aisles here. Okay. Anyway, this is the transept, or the crossing, as it were. And then over here is the apse with smaller chapels. All around Chartres are these wonderful stained glass windows. And this is a whole tour of what we might call salvation history, right? The whole story of the Bible and the lives of saints. It starts over here on the north side of the building with, as you enter, the west door, with depictions from the Old Testament. There are, the Genesis and Exodus and things like this are all here. When you get over to here, we begin to have New Testament stories, and then kind of the high point of the windows is in the apse here, with depictions of the life of Jesus, crucifixion, resurrection, all of that. And then over here on the south side of the building, we have stories of the lives of saints, including, interestingly, Charlemagne, who was not hailed universally as a saint, but was seen as a great Christian ruler. There's a whole window devoted to Charlemagne here, right? Another recognizable feature of Chartres Cathedral, as most Gothic cathedrals, is this round window called the rose window. And there is one on the western side, the western facade over here. There's one on the south, and there's also one on the north, right? The rose was the symbol of Mary, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. And in fact, most Gothic cathedrals are named after Mary. They are known as the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Notre Dame in French means Our Lady, which is one of the titles of Mary. It's a way to refer to Mary. Okay. And so this is the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Chartres. There's also a famous cathedral in Paris known as Notre Dame de Paris. And there are lots of other Notre Dames in other parts of France, right? So this is the Cathedral of the Virgin in Chartres. And these rose windows are the symbol of the Virgin Mary, and these depict some of them, at least. This is the north rose window in Chartres. This depicts scenes from the life of Mary. She is, or rather, it has her as the central feature. It's not from her life necessarily, but she is the central figure in this window. You can see that she is seated with Jesus on her lap. This is the Madonna and Child image. And she's surrounded by, angels here, and then these are all the ancient Israelite kings from whom Mary was descended. And then over here we have prophets from the Old Testament, right? So all of this leading up to Mary, so to speak. That's part of her inheritance. So there's a good deal of imagery about Mary in these buildings, okay? A couple of things you can see about Gothic cathedrals in Chartres. There were exterior supports to hold up the arches. These are called flying buttresses. And you can see at every point of greatest stress on these arches, there are these flying buttresses that extend out from the cathedral here. There's also a great deal of creativity in the towers. On the western side of these buildings, they usually built large towers. Sometimes they also built towers in the middle. These are conical towers on Chartres. And you can see the development of Gothic over time, because this is a 13th century tower, the South Tower. This one was built in the 15th century, and they didn't build them in different... They built the 15th century tower in the new style of Gothic, which just became more and more elaborate over time. And so lots more crenellations and things like this on this tower than on this tower, which is rather more simple. And all of that allowed them to achieve tremendous height in the building, again, to represent heaven. In any case, Chartres is a wonderful example of this. Here is another, maybe the most famous window in all of Chartres. This is called the Blue Virgin of Chartres. It's a late 12th century window. Mary depicted with this vivid blue clothing with Jesus on her lap, right? So another example of stained glass. And you can see the creativity, the color here, the efforts they had to go through to create the frames for these windows and place the colored glass in them and all of that, right? Here's Cologne again. You can see the height. I don't know why I had that on there again. You can see a good example of flying buttresses. Maybe the best example is the one in Paris. Buttresses, both lower and upper buttresses here. You can see the kind of the crenellations and things like that. These are crenellations up here. Standard features of Gothic cathedrals. Also gargoyles, which were served dual purpose of being downspouts for water, and also were thought to sort of drive away evil spirits. So, you can see all of that. The busyness of Gothic is one of its features. The height of these buildings, Salisbury Cathedral in southern England has this tremendously high tower. I think this one's over 100 meters. Well, it's well over 100 meters. It's like 150 meters tall or something like that. So this is a tremendously high building. By the mid-13th century, Gothic has just become incredibly elaborate. This is the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, the kind of personal chapel of the kings of France, and you can see that every inch of this building is covered in some decoration, whether it's the stained glass windows, and again, like Chartres, we have the Old Testament over here, and then the Passion and Resurrection windows in the apse, and then stories of saints' lives and things like that over here. But even the upper reaches are decorated in the fleur-de-lis pattern, the symbol of the French kings. Lots of other decoration, whether it's paint or gold work, gold filigree, or other things all over this building, right? So it becomes, again, more and more elaborate over time. Interior and exterior, this is Reims Cathedral from the 13th century, where the tombs of the kings of France were, where the French kings were buried. And these statues up here depict all of the French kings from the Middle Ages, going back to Charlemagne. In fact, I think it goes back even further than that, back to back to Pepin the Short, perhaps, or maybe even back to Clovis. You can see all of the busyness, crenellations, spikes, and gargoyles, and statuary, and other things here, along with 2 rose windows on the western facade. The vaulting becomes more elaborate. This is Bath Abbey in England, 15th century flamboyant Gothic. And you can see that every inch is covered in some kind of decoration. Again, even in the stonework, there's a great deal of elaboration, right? Okay, so that's one product of high culture that I want to talk about. A second would be the products of the schools, okay? And specifically a philosophical system known as scholasticism. That's a rather nondescript term. It's one that requires some depth of understanding, but I will try to simplify this as much as I can here, okay? There was a debate among medieval churchmen over the role that reason, the capacity for reason and analysis should play in the life of a Christian. One late 11th, early 12th century churchman who was quite influential, his name was Anselm. He was for a time the abbot of the monastery of Bec in northern France and later became the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. But Anselm had the perspective of what we might call faith-seeking understanding. I want to go to a text from Anselm here, so I'm going to go to my web browser. And this is a text called the Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man. Okay, and that was the question that Anselm wanted to take up here, was to really answer why God had to assume human form, right? One of the key theological questions that animated this whole period. And he says here at the beginning of this work, so this is the part of the text that I want to refer to, all right? I have been often and most earnestly requested by many, both personally and by letter, that I would hand down in writing the proofs of a certain doctrine of our faith, which I am accustomed to give to inquirers, for they say that these proofs gratify them and are considered sufficient. Now, we need to point out the meanings of a couple of words here. Proof means logical proof, as in formal logic, right? If you haven't taken a logic class, you don't understand what that means. This means, something that cannot be, or that abides by the rules of logic, it's really more mathematical than anything, right? And so Anselm has worked out these proofs, demonstrating the need for God to take on human form. All right. Now, the second sentence is the one that I really want to refer to, though, the one that I want to discuss. This they ask, so these people have asked him for these proofs. This they ask not for the sake of attaining to faith by means of reason, but that they may be gladdened by understanding and meditating on those things which they believe, and that as far as possible they may always be ready to convince anyone who demands of them a reason of that hope which is in us. Now, Anselm is kind of doing a balancing act here. He's saying that these proofs are not meant to convince anyone of the truth of Christianity, of Christian theology. Rather, they are to be enjoyed by people who already believe that Christian theology is true. It's sort of like this, it's nice to know that what we believe actually makes sense, but it's not really intrinsic to our belief. That's the perspective that Anselm has, although he has to say here that they may be ready to convince anyone who demands of them a reason of that hope which is in us. In other words, this might be used to convince, but that's really not what he's after here, because for Anselm, as for a lot of other intellectuals in this period, reason could not be prior to faith. Everything had to go back to a foundation of faith. Reason was something that allowed them to work out logically that what they believed was actually true, that it abided by the principles of reason, right? Now, there were some who were discontented with that perspective, right? Among these is our friend Abelard, Peter Abelard, okay? Now, let's go back to the slide here. I want to talk about Abelard and Heloise before I go to the seek et non, because I might as well tell the story. This is one of the most intriguing stories, I think, from all of Western history. At least I find it so. You read this, of course, in the Historia Calamitatum, which is assigned for this week. Abelard was the brilliant schoolmaster of Paris. He had attained a reputation for intellectual brilliance, though he had made, of course, a lot of enemies, as you read about in the Historia Calamitatum. He had, been appointed as the schoolmaster of Paris. Now, as a teacher in a cathedral school, Abelard had to take vows of celibacy. He had to, even if he was not ordained as a priest, which it seems he wasn't, he was considered a clergyman and thus had to be celibate. Now, Abelard was, I think, less than interested in actually being celibate because, of course, as you read in his story, he pursued this young woman named Heloise, who was probably 20 years younger than him, by the way. But that shouldn't, standards were different during that time. As it turns out, Heloise was, it seems, pursuing him just as much as he was pursuing her. He arranged to become her teacher. She was the ward of a canon of the cathedral, another churchman, who was kind of her guardian. And so Abelard offered to teach her. This teaching led, of course, to an affair, to a sexual relationship. Heloise became pregnant, and Fulbert, who was her guardian, found out about this, became very angry with Abelard, and this, of course, threatened Abelard's career, mostly because he was supposed to be celibate, right? But he'd also angered one of his bosses, one of the canons of the cathedral, and so Abelard and Heloise ran away from Paris and had the child in Brittany, where Abelard had come from. gave the child up for adoption to her sister, to his sister, I should say, and returned to Paris, probably intending to continue the life that they had started for themselves before she became pregnant. Fulbert, though, was angry. Now, why was Fulbert angry? Abelard doesn't necessarily say. He just says he didn't like me. Abelard seems to have taken a lot of things personally. But really, the problem for Fulbert was that he was her guardian. He was supposed to see to her marriage, or something like that, or maybe to making her a nun. And Abelard had kind of damaged her, knocked her up, as it were, right? Sorry, I had to get a drink. I got a tickle in my throat here. Okay. In any case, Fulbert put a lot of pressure on Abelard to marry Heloise. And it seems, and Heloise corroborates this in her letter, that she objected to this. She didn't want Abelard's career to be ruined. She didn't want to take him away from his students. She was more interested in this physical relationship and emotional relationship they had. She didn't care if they got married. But under pressure from Fulbert, Abelard convinced her to get married. They got married, and then they arranged for her to enter a convent, which would effectively annul the marriage. Even if it was shown that Abelard was married, he could say, well, my wife is now a nun, and so really we're not in, I'm still celibate. This might also afford Abelard the opportunity to continue to visit Heloise and continue their relationship. It's uncertain. But Fulbert saw this as a trick, and so as you read in all its grisly detail in the Historia Calamitatum, Fulbert hired some thugs who broke into Abelard's apartment one night, beat him up, and castrated him, right? And thus they were not able to continue their sexual relationship because of Abelard's condition. He was damaged goods at this point. So they both decided to take up the monastic life. And so Abelard became a monk. Heloise remained a nun. And about 15 years after this, Abelard wrote an account of his calamities, as he calls them, right? Heloise read this and responded to him in a letter. And she says in that letter, and I'm not going to have you read the entire correspondence, although I think it's definitely worth reading, but she says she's a bit reluctant to even identify herself. She says, how does she put it? I don't have the text in front of me, but to her husband, know her brother, from his wife, know his sister, and she really doesn't know how to address him, right? They're technically married, but they've been separated and in their own monasteries for 15 years. In any case, this letter is full of heartbreak, right? Heloise, it's quite obvious from that letter, is quite a progressive woman. She has these opinions about sexuality and things that really fly in the face of the standard beliefs and practices of the Middle Ages. She even says quite shocking things like the one point, if Augustus Caesar deigned to make me his empress, I would happily give all of that up to be your whore instead, right? She uses these quite shocking terms, even calling herself a whore, and the Latin word she uses at one point for that is the most filthy thing you can imagine, the most filthy slur you can imagine, and all of that is really done kind of for shock value to say, look, all I really wanted was to be in this relationship with you. I didn't care about marriage or about security or anything like that, right? And so the question that you have to confront this week in the prompt, the paper prompt that you're going to write is, assuming you are going to write this, if you haven't written the other three and perhaps decide to skip this one, is what pressures are placed on Abelard and Heloise? What's going on? What's happening with these two people in context, right? Why did Abelard feel like he had to marry Heloise, and why did they decide on this whole arrangement for her to go into a convent, and why did they give up their child, and what was motivating Fulbert and all of that. You need to explain all of that in the paper. So hopefully that's enough guidance for actually writing this paper. That this won't cause too much consternation. Although you're certainly welcome to address this issue in the discussion boards, ask questions, make comments about this. I think this text is hopefully interesting. I find it fascinating. So hopefully that's helpful. Now, to go back, now that I've given the story of Abelard, we can understand his intellectual activities a little bit better. After his castration, while he was a monk, he wrote a work called the Sic et Non. This was kind of his master work. If the Historia Calamitatum is his most famous, this one is his most profound. Sic et Non means yes and no. And the title really kind of explains the purpose of the work. The purpose of the work is to confront contradictions that one might notice in Christian theology. And he points that out. In the prologue to the work, he says, and I'm reading here from the text, there are many seeming contradictions and even obscurities in the innumerable writings of the Church Fathers. Now, that is to say, in the texts we consider authoritative, the ones that are supposed to have all the answers. The writings of Augustine and Gregory and Ambrose and Jerome, we find contradictions. They don't always completely cohere. They don't always make sense, right? I'm sure a lot of people had noticed this before. Abelard is the first one really to point that out and to say we shouldn't shy away from trying to understand the contradictions. He goes on to say our respect for their authority, that word is important, right? Authority was respected in the Middle Ages. These texts that were considered authoritative were thought to be beyond reproach. Abelard is saying, look, we can respect their authority at the same time as we notice their contradictions. So our respect for their authority should not stand in the way of an effort on our part to come at the truth. The obscurities and contradictions in ancient writings may be explained on many grounds and may be discussed without impugning the good faith and insight of the Fathers. So what must be employed to work out the contradictions? Faith is not sufficient. In fact, faith is not even the question here. Abelard never even refers to faith, right? Instead, he says we have to use reason. We have to use the principles of logic. We have to notice the contradictions, point them out, and use our reasonable capacities given to us by God to sort out the contradictions and to make sense of them, right? To produce proofs, in fact, in support of the doctrines of Christianity. Now, this was not always well received. Abelard himself, for some of the things that he wrote, some of these proofs he produced, was considered a heretic by some of his opponents, and in fact was headed to Rome toward the end of his life to answer to charges of heresy. At one point, Abelard actually was forced to recant some of his writings and even to burn the only copy. Let's remember there's no printing press, and so he hand wrote this, the only copy of a book he had written that he had devoted several years of his life to writing. Right. Abelard became sick on the journey to Rome, ended up in the monastery of Cluny under the protection of his friend Peter the Venerable, the abbot of Cluny. Cluny was probably the most powerful monastery in all of Christendom at this point, and died there. Peter the Venerable, who was also acquainted with Heloise, sent Abelard's corpse for burial to Heloise. He was buried in her monastery, the Paraclete as it was called, over which he had acted as a kind of patron and spiritual director. So things came full circle. Now, that was the response to Abelard in his own day. In the generations after Abelard, however, just about every intellectual took up his style of thinking. Maybe most importantly is the figure Thomas Aquinas. And I realize this lecture is running a bit long, and so I just want to kind of summarize what Thomas was doing. Thomas Aquinas was the most important philosopher after Augustine, arguably. Anselm was also a philosopher of some renown, but I mean, the sheer volume of the writings of Thomas Aquinas is just breathtaking in its scope. Um, he was so prolific that he kept an entire army of scribes busy night and day, it seems. He invented shorthand, a shorthand system so they could keep up with his dictations. And one of his works, and this is only one of them, although it is his longest, is called the Summa Theologiae. Summa means really summary, overview, or expansive exploration of every possible topic of theology, theologiae, right? So the summation of theology. And in this work, which runs several thousand pages, Thomas confronts just about every possible theological question. And he does so largely following the pattern that Abelard had laid out. And so let's look at an example here. Okay, this is early in the work. Thomas starts with a very basic question of, does God exist, right? And so he first has to say, can we come up with a proof for God's existence? Can we, is it just self-evident, or can we demonstrate it using logic? And so he goes through all of that, and then he comes to some logical proofs. Now he starts by pointing out a contradiction. He says, it seems that God does not exist because if one of two contrary things were infinite, its opposite would be completely destroyed. By God, however, we mean some infinite good. In other words, if there is an infinite thing, then its opposite cannot exist, right? By God, we mean good. Therefore, if God existed, evil would not. Evil does exist in the world, however, therefore God does not exist, right? Well, that's an interesting proof for the non-existence of God, and it's one that has been employed even by modern atheists. If God existed, then evil would not exist. Well, evil does exist, right? And then he also says one should not needlessly multiply elements in an explanation. It seems we can account for everything in the world, either by referring to human will or to natural effects, or natural causes, I should say. Therefore, there's no reason to suppose that God exists, right? On the other hand, and here's the contradiction, on the contrary, God says, I am who I am. In other words, the sacred text, the Bible that everyone considers authoritative, says there is a God. So how do we work this out? Well, Anselm then proceeds logically in a series of 5 proofs to demonstrate the existence of God. And then he responds to the objections after having proved the existence of God. And I'm not going to take time to go through these proofs, but suffice it to say that they abide by the principles of logic. They draw both from Plato and especially from Aristotle, who was Thomas's exemplar philosophically. Okay. By the time Thomas had finished the Summa Theologiae, people said he worked it all out. He figured out everything, right? There was a great deal of optimism from this. Only a couple of generations later did people begin to question some of the ideas of Thomas, even in some cases to consider him heretical. It happened to just about every great mind in this period. Now, let's move on just for a few minutes here. And I know this is running long. I apologize for that. I'm trying to cram a lot of information into this lecture. Let's talk about vernacular literature as a final example of medieval culture. All right. Now, there are 2 genres, again, one follows the other, that animated vernacular literature. And this happened in the court setting where knights and ladies would come together. They wanted entertainment. There were storytellers, performers who would compose these things and perform them. This was the great entertainment of the day. The first genre, and one that's quite understandable for its appeal to a knightly warrior audience, is epic. And epic is not something original to the Middle Ages. This was, of course, invented in antiquity. Homer and Virgil and others wrote epics, and so these medieval poets were following in that Western tradition. A good example of epic is the poem known as the Song of Roland. This is the story of a warrior named Roland, who was one of the warriors in Charlemagne's army. He was tasked, in this story specifically, with guarding the rear of Charlemagne's army as it passed from Spain, where Charlemagne had waged a campaign, back into France. And as it turns out, there was a traitor named Ganilo, who colluded with the Muslims to attack Charlemagne's army, to ambush the rear guard, and thus to waylay his army as it was going across the Pyrenees. The head of the rear guard again is Roland. Now, in this story, you can see here one of the characters is named Oliver. He is Roland's best friend and comrade in arms. Oliver spots these Muslims. He calls them pagans. Pagans and Muslims were usually conflated in the Middle Ages by these Christians. Pagans in force abound, but of us Franks, but very few I count. Comrade Roland, your horn I pray you sound. If Charles here, he'll turn his armies round. In other words, sound your horn, sound the warning, so that Charlemagne knows we're being attacked and he can come back and bail us out. But Roland says, no, I'm not going to do that. A fool I should be found. In France the deuce would perish my renown. And with Durendal, that's his sword. As a brief aside here, Tolkien, in writing The Lord of the Rings and other works, was drawing a lot from this medieval literature, especially epic, and the naming of swords is one example of that. Okay, end of diversion there. With Durendal, with my sword I'll lay on thick and stout, in blood the blade to its golden hilt I'll drown. Felon pagans to the pass shall not come down. I pledge you now to death they all are bound. In good rhyming couplets here in this translation, right? In other words, I'm not going to lose my chance to be a hero. And Oliver says, okay, let's do it. And pretty much the rest of the story is just one big battle scene. Cast of thousands, these Muslim armies pouring down on the rear guard, and Roland and Oliver and their fellow warriors fighting heroically to defend Charles's army from this. And they do so heroically, and the action follows one warrior and then another, and they successfully defend against this ambush. And at the very end, as Roland lays mortally wounded from the many wounds he has received, he picks up his horn and blows it so that Charles can come back and bear witness to the heroic acts that he has done, right? That he and his fellow warriors have accomplished. That's epic, and you can see why knights would get so worked up about this. They love these kinds of stories. But there were also ladies in the audience, and they didn't necessarily go for all of this, right? And I don't want to draw on any modern stereotypes here, but we might say stereotypically that a boyfriend and girlfriend are arguing over what movie to see, and the guy wants to go see some epic with lots of battle scenes and bloodshed and special effects and things like that, and the girl wants to go see a romantic comedy or something. Not saying that's for everybody, but we could apply that to these medieval audiences. Women, and there were some elite women who were sponsors of this literature, wanted a different kind of story, and so that's where we end up with the genre of romance. The example that I've given you this week is one of the stories of Chrétien de Troyes, one of the troubadours who wrote romance in France in the 12th century. This is the story of Lancelot. Much of this, many of these tales, maybe most of them, in fact, are stories of the knights of King Arthur, even though most of this is written in Old French rather than English, right? The story of Arthur animated a lot of imaginations in this period. This tale is still of a warrior, as most of the romance is, but it's a warrior motivated by love, by the love of a lady. In this case, it's a lady who happens to be married to his lord, to the king, but he's motivated by this, right? And so Lancelot sets out to rescue Guinevere from a knight who has taken her captive, and he comes across all sorts of peril during this. In one part of the story, he has to cross a bridge made out of a sword, and he has to fight lions and other things, right? So he has to do these heroic deeds. But in other parts of the story, the threats are not quite so overt. They're more subtle and internal. In this one scene, he comes to a castle which is owned by a woman, and he needs shelter. He also needs information on where to go to find Guinevere. This woman has those things, but she says to him, I will let you stay here only on condition that you sleep with me. And Lancelot is caught at that point. As a chivalrous knight, he cannot refuse the request of a woman, of a lady, and so he has to agree with her, has to agree to her terms. He stays there, And but he doesn't want to do this. He wants to prove his love and his faithfulness to Guinevere. And this gets even more rich as he goes up to her bedchamber and finds her being attacked by several knights who are about to rape her. He has to decide whether he's going to defend her only to have to sleep with her. He has to risk his life for a woman now who he doesn't love and doesn't want to be with. And so all of this peril is internal. When he defeats the knights who look like they're about to rape her, it turns out she calls for him to stop, and it turns out she set up the whole thing. And she finally only lets Lancelot off the hook when he lays down in bed with her and makes no move to be intimate with her. And she finally says, look, I can see your heart belongs to someone else, and I'll leave you in peace, right? Well, this is the kind of thing that appealed to this mixed audience. You have to imagine that the women in the audience love to see the men squirm as these troubadours told these tales of these knights who are caught by these clever women in these ruses. So this is the kind of literature that appealed, and this was again written, composed, and performed in the vernacular literature, in French or in English or the other languages of Western Europe. So a very important contribution to Western culture. That brings us to the end of the course. I know that's a rather abrupt end. Unfortunately, we do not have room to continue into the late Middle Ages, which would probably be a more fitting end for this, but we end with Abelard and Heloise and the creation of vernacular literature. Hopefully this course has been a valuable experience for you, and look forward to reading what you have to write about Abelard and Heloise, and you can also look forward to, maybe not look forward to, I don't know, the final exam, all of which you can find on the course website on Canvas. Thank you for a good summer term, and I will maybe see you in a future course.